A passenger attacked a colonel's nephew mid-flight. Seconds later, the colonel ended the fight in a way no one saw coming. He thought stabbing a young man would prove his strength. He didn't realize the boy's uncle was a soldier forged in war, not fear. Subscribe if you believe no one should harm the innocent and escape justice. A sudden jolt shivered through the fuselage, just enough to make the overhead lights flicker and the seatbelt sign chime softly. Colonel Adrian Heller opened his eyes at once. He hadn't been asleep. He never really slept on planes, but rather he had been listening. To the engines, to the rhythm of the air, to the silence of danger that sometimes came disguised as calm. He glanced across the aisle. Ethan was still there, nose nearly pressed to the window, his breath fogging the glass as he tried to spot the shapes of cities buried beneath the cloud layers. The boy's excitement was pure. Too pure, Heller thought, for someone tied to a name that had endured so much loss. His nephew had always been bright, but lately there was something deeper behind his curiosity, like he was trying to remember something he didn't know he'd forgotten. The colonel shifted slightly, stretching a stiff shoulder, then looked around the cabin, not out of paranoia, but out of practice. Row 8 caught his attention, specifically the man seated by the aisle. Grant Thorne. He hadn't done anything, hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't even ordered a drink when the cart passed by. But his eyes, they were wrong. He stared too long at Ethan, not constantly but deliberately, and each time his gaze dropped briefly to the brown leather satchel under his feet. Something small rested inside, rigid enough to press against the canvas. Not a laptop, too narrow for a book. The colonel's instincts hummed. He didn't reach for his weapon. He wasn't armed, not on a civilian flight, but his fingers flexed slightly against the armrest as if his body remembered a time when danger meant movement, not waiting. Ethan turned and caught his uncle's stare. "You okay?" Heller nodded once. "Clouds get boring fast." Ethan smiled, a little sheepish. "Just trying to enjoy the peace before you drag me up another mountain or through another field course." Heller allowed the faintest curl of a smile. "Peace is temporary. Best to learn that before it gets taken." The words hung awkwardly, heavier than he'd intended. Ethan turned back to the window. Across the aisle, Grant Thorne shifted. Not much, just leaned down, tugged the satchel closer, then let his hand rest on top. His knuckles were pale. His thumb tapped twice, slow and controlled. It wasn't a nervous tick. It was a rhythm, a trigger. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me," Ethan said suddenly, unbuckling. "Going to the restroom before they wheel that cart back again." Heller's attention snapped to the timing. The aisle was empty. The attendants were 2 rows down, chatting quietly. Grant didn't move as Ethan passed, but his head turned slightly. Too slightly. Heller's breath caught. Something was wrong, but he waited, watched. The overhead mirror caught a narrow reflection, the space between rows where the lavatory door stood slightly ajar. A flicker of movement, then a hand, then a muffled gasp, like someone's breath had been stolen mid-word. The colonel was already up. By the time he reached the aisle, the cabin had shifted into a fragile pause, a quiet before a scream. His boots hit the aisle carpet fast, smooth, almost too quiet for a man of his age. He pushed past 2 confused passengers who hadn't even turned yet. Ethan was collapsing. Blood shimmered down his cheek like red ink leaking through paper. And standing above him, knife in hand, arm trembling, was Grant Thorne. The blade was small, military style, not standard issue, but Heller had seen it before, once in a different country, on a different face. The colonel's voice sliced through the air like a blade of its own. "Step away from him." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was the voice of a man who had seen death and denied it permission. Passengers froze. One man dropped his cup. Another fumbled for a phone. A third began to whisper prayers. Grant blinked rapidly. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, only the sound of the bloodied blade rattling ever so slightly between his fingers. Ethan groaned. Heller didn't look away from the attacker, didn't even blink. His entire body was steel tension. One wrong twitch, and he would close the distance. The flight attendant appeared behind him, eyes wide. "Sir, please." But she stopped when she saw Ethan, stopped when she saw the knife, and when she saw the look in the colonel's eyes, she stepped back. Heller's jaw flexed. "Put the weapon down." Grant's knuckles turned white. He said nothing. His jaw clenched and his gaze darted, not to Ethan, not to Heller, but to the satchel still lying beneath his row. That's when Heller understood. This wasn't random. This wasn't madness. It was mission. He took one step forward. The blade raised slightly, shaking. "I won't ask again," the colonel said, voice like gravel over steel. In his mind, something old stirred. Memories of deserts, of whispered names on radios, of blood and sand and broken orders. Men like Thorne didn't carry blades like that without reason, and they didn't come for teenagers without being told. The air thickened. Time stretched. And in that breathless stillness, Heller felt the war return, not from the outside, but from within him. "Some storms," Heller often said, "don't form in the clouds. They form in men." The muffled scuffle began as nothing more than a whisper of motion. A soft thud, barely noticeable above the steady drone of the engines, broke through the hum of conversation. Then came another sound, sharper this time, the unmistakable scrape of a shoe against metal flooring. A man in seat 9 glanced over his shoulder, frowning, but said nothing. Passengers assumed turbulence, but turbulence did not make people gasp. A cry pierced the cabin, short, strangled, cut off too quickly to be an accident. Heads turned. The aisle that had moments ago been filled with murmurs and laughter was now heavy with confusion. Colonel Adrian Heller rose from his seat like a spring pulled too long, his instincts firing before his mind could shape a thought. He had heard that sound before, too many times. It was the sound of a blade meeting flesh. He moved down the narrow aisle with military precision, his steps firm, deliberate, unhurried. Every second stretched into eternity. As he approached the lavatory, a metallic glint caught his eye from the overhead reflection, just enough to see a shape bending over another. A reflection of motion, of violence. The image froze in his mind for an instant before reality surged forward. Ethan collapsed sideways against the narrow corridor wall, his hand pressed weakly to his head, crimson spreading across his fingers. The sight hit Heller like a gunshot. Grant Thorne stood above him, his knuckles white around a small knife whose blade quivered under the dim cabin lights. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The hum of the engines became deafening, and the air itself seemed to tighten, as though the plane had stopped breathing. "Step away from him." Heller's voice cut through the paralysis like a command on a battlefield. The tone was not a plea. It was an order honed by years of leading men through chaos. His gaze locked onto Grant's, cold and unflinching. Around them, passengers froze in their seats, afraid to intervene, afraid to even blink. Grant's lips parted, trembling. He looked at me," he stammered, his eyes unfocused. The words made no sense, but his grip tightened on the weapon. His pupils darted wildly, flicking from Heller to the bleeding boy at his feet. There was something wrong in his face, an emptiness behind the panic as though he wasn't entirely here. Heller's mind raced, but his expression remained stone. His instincts screamed to act, but discipline restrained him for one crucial second. He scanned the cabin, 3 rows to the cockpit door, 2 to the emergency exits, 20 sets of eyes watching in terror. The knife was small, but its damage was already done. Ethan's blood glistened on the blade, proof enough of intent. "Drop it," Heller said evenly, stepping closer. His tone softened just slightly. the kind that could coax surrender from men moments away from breaking. Whatever you think you're doing, it ends now. Grant blinked hard, confusion flickering behind the madness. You don't understand, he whispered. He's not supposed to be here. None of this was supposed to happen. His voice cracked, his breathing ragged. They said he wouldn't. He stopped himself abruptly, as if realizing he'd said too much. The colonel's eyes narrowed. There was no time to unravel madness. He took another step forward, his stance balanced, his muscles coiled. Put it down, he repeated. Grant's hand trembled, then steadied again. The motion was wrong, too deliberate, too controlled. Heller recognized the stance of a trained hand. Whoever this man was, he wasn't an ordinary civilian. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with fear. Ethan groaned softly, shifting on the floor, blood pooling beneath his cheek. The faint sound tore through the colonel's restraint like paper. The protective instinct, the same one that had saved lives on battlefields, ignited in an instant. Grant raised the knife again. The next moments blurred. Heller lunged forward, one arm sweeping the weapon hand aside, his other striking Grant squarely in the chest. The impact sent the attacker staggering backward into the aisle, his arm flailing as the knife clattered once, then settled near a passenger's foot. Gasps filled the air, someone screamed. Heller didn't let him recover. He pressed his forearm against Grant's throat, pinning him against a seat back. The man struggled violently, his words turning into garbled pleas. "You don't know what he is," he hissed. "What he is," Heller growled, his voice shaking with barely contained fury, "is my family." Grant's elbow caught the colonel's ribs. Pain flared, but it only fueled Heller's focus. He shifted his weight, twisting Grant's wrist until a sharp crack echoed. The knife fell completely from his grip this time, skidding across the floor. Heller's knee came down, pressing him into submission. "Help!" a passenger shouted. "Somebody call the crew." A flight attendant appeared, pale and trembling, speaking into her radio. "We need medical assistance, row 8, possible stabbing." Her voice broke midway, the training overtaken by panic. Ethan coughed weakly, his voice barely audible. "Uncle?" Heller turned just enough to see his nephew's eyes flutter open. The relief hit him hard, too hard, but he didn't let go of the man beneath him. "Stay still, Ethan," he ordered firmly. "You're going to be all right." The air reeked of metal and fear. Grant's breathing grew ragged. "It wasn't supposed to be you," he muttered again, voice fading into a broken whisper. "He's not supposed to be alive." Those words chilled Heller deeper than the sight of blood. He didn't understand them, but he would remember them. Somewhere in the confusion, he felt the weight of something larger than this single act, as though this moment was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The knife glimmered in the aisle light, the blood on it glistening like a dark mirror. The flight attendants hovered near the cockpit, too afraid to intervene further. Heller, still kneeling, stared down at Grant Thorne, whose eyes had gone glassy but defiant. The colonel's own reflection in the window looked older than he remembered, haunted, resolute, and ready for whatever came next. The silence that followed felt eternal, heavy with the gravity of what had been unleashed. "No man harms my family and walks away." The knife flashed again. Grant lunged without warning, a wild arc of silver slicing through the cabin air, aimed straight at Heller's throat. But the colonel had moved before his mind had even caught up. Years of battlefield instinct took over. He ducked low, sidestepped with the fluidity of a man who had once trained others to survive ambushes, and seized Grant's wrist mid-swing. The bones ground beneath his grip. Grant cried out, his entire arm shuddering from the pressure. The blade clattered to the floor, bouncing once before spinning to a stop near seat 14B. A passenger gasped. Another screamed. The aisle erupted with chaos, men pushing back against their seats, others leaping to their feet, all caught in a blur of panic and disbelief. Flight attendants shouted over one another, their voices cracking under pressure, trying to calm a storm that no manual had prepared them for. "Move!" Heller barked to the crew, his voice a crack of thunder through the din. "Seal the cabin, lock it down, and tell the cockpit now." One of the younger attendants, a lean man with shaking hands, stood frozen, eyes wide with horror as blood spread beneath Ethan's head. Heller didn't waste time repeating himself. He lowered his tone to something colder, deeper, like steel scraping against concrete. "Do it now," he said, locking eyes with the attendant, "or we lose him." The man snapped into action, fumbling for the cabin intercom, his voice stammering through the announcement as the plane jolted slightly, not from turbulence, but from the weight of the moment. Grant, gasping, twisted violently beneath Heller. With a burst of adrenaline, he threw his shoulder back, catching the colonel off balance. He slipped from Heller's grip, elbows knocking into trays, legs kicking wildly, one foot catching the kneecap of a nearby passenger who yelped in pain and fell sideways. Grant's eyes, wild, unfocused, scanned for the knife. He spotted it. "No," Heller growled, lunging forward. But Grant was already crawling, his hands slapping the floor, fingertips grazing the blade's handle. Then, interception. Heller dropped his full weight forward, pinning Grant's torso with one knee while wrenching the attacker's right arm behind his back. The man bucked like a trapped animal, his screams choked and feral. Blood streaked the wall beside them, some Ethan's, some Grant's. The noise of the scuffle had dissolved into a deafening silence, broken only by the rhythmic gasping of the wounded and the hum of the engines continuing their steady journey through the clouds. Passengers near the front of the plane pressed themselves against the windows, as if trying to disappear into the fuselage. One man held up his phone, recording with trembling fingers. Another muttered prayers. Still, no one interfered. Heller didn't let go. He tightened the arm lock, using it to drive Grant's body down onto the metal of the armrest. His breath was shallow but steady, counting each second, measuring every decision. He could feel the tremble in his own hands, the echo of old pain stirring in his joints, but his grip never wavered. "You stabbed a boy," Heller muttered into Grant's ear, low and venomous. "You crossed a line you can't uncross." Grant's body stopped struggling. For a moment, it was as if the weight of what he'd done crashed into him. He sagged beneath Heller, chest heaving, lips moving without sound. "He shouldn't have looked at me," he whispered again, voice broken. That face doesn't belong here." "What face?" Heller snapped, his mind catching something beneath the madness. "What do you mean?" But Grant didn't answer. His eyes stared blankly at the wall, his breathing a ragged mess of guilt, confusion, and something more, something like fear. Heller shifted his gaze back to Ethan. His nephew lay slumped against the galley wall, head tilted, a wet stream of red sliding across his temple and pooling beneath him. The compress he'd pressed earlier had slipped. The colonel lunged back across the aisle, retrieving it with quick, sharp movements. He pressed it down firmly on the wound again, applying pressure, murmuring words that barely escaped his mouth. "You're all right," he said softly. "You're gonna hold on, son. I've got you." He didn't hear the murmurs of the crew in the background or the passengers behind him debating whether to help. All he heard was Ethan's weak, sputtering breath. All he saw was the face of a young man caught in the crosshairs of a madness that didn't belong on any flight path. He looked once more at Grant, now restrained by another passenger who had stepped in, a burly man in a maintenance uniform who hadn't spoken a word the entire flight. The man gave Heller a grim nod. Together, they kept Grant pressed to the floor, his mouth spitting fragments of nonsense about names and shadows. Blood had smeared across the aisle, between seats, across shoes, even onto the silver edge of a fallen food tray. The once sterile cabin felt like the aftermath of something far older than a mid-air assault. It felt like a battlefield. Heller's shoulders were tight with fury and something else, something he didn't want to name just yet. Dread. He kept pressure on Ethan's wound, his lips moving in a silent rhythm of reassurance, his eyes never leaving his nephew's. Sometimes, Heller thought as his hand remained firm. Violence doesn't end. It simply waits for another flight. Blood smeared across Colonel Heller's palm as he pressed it firmly against Ethan's wound. The plane jolted slightly, but it wasn't turbulence, just the chaos of bodies shifting, voices rising, panic spreading like smoke through a sealed chamber. A man in a Navy business suit knelt beside him without a word, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and folding it with methodical care. "I have first aid training," the man said, calm but urgent. His hands moved with practiced precision as he replaced Heller's makeshift grip with a cleaner compress. "Name's Nathan Price." "Don't worry, I've got this." Heller didn't answer. His eyes were locked on Grant Thorne, who had stumbled backward, hands trembling as if waking from a fevered dream. The knife still glistened on the floor beside him, coated with the fresh blood of a boy who never saw it coming. The attacker's lips twitched, and then words escaped, brittle and jagged. "He's not supposed to exist," Grant muttered, his voice thin and distorted, like a transmission on a failing radio. "Not with that face." The colonel's jaw clenched. The words didn't register as a threat, but as something far worse. A claim. A riddle sewn with intent. His grip on the seatback tightened as he rose, the knuckles whitening beneath old scars. "Why him?" he demanded, stepping closer, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. Grant's eyes darted to Ethan, then away, twitching with something more than fear. "You don't get it," he whispered. "You never got it. You were supposed to protect him from the world, not from the truth." Before Heller could press further, the intercom crackled above them. "This is your captain. We are initiating an emergency diversion to Vance Airfield. Please remain seated and await further instructions." The calm tone of the pilot contrasted sharply with the spiraling tension inside the cabin. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments, swinging like pendulums of dread. Several passengers gasped, others froze, unsure whether to brace for impact or scream. In that split second of distraction, Grant surged forward. His boot slammed into Heller's shin with enough force to unbalance him. The colonel stumbled, momentarily off guard. Grant dove for the knife, his hand outstretched, inches from the hilt. Time seemed to stutter. Nathan, still kneeling beside Ethan, snapped into action. Without hesitation, he lunged sideways, slamming his shoulder into Grant's ribs. The attacker reeled sideways, grunting from the impact, but his hand still found the weapon. Heller recovered. In a flash, he stepped over Ethan's body and closed the gap. His hand caught Grant's wrist mid-swing, fingers locking with bone-crushing pressure. He twisted sharply. Grant let out a strained cry as the blade clattered onto the floor again. "You don't get to make this choice," Heller growled, yanking the man upward by the collar. The soldier in him returned fully now, not just the commander, but the weapon forged by years of combat and command. "You don't get to decide who lives in the light." Grant writhed, but his strength came from desperation, not training. The colonel forced him backward, slamming him into the armrest with a thud that rattled the surrounding seats. A passenger screamed. Others backed away, wide-eyed. Blood from Ethan's earlier injury had stained Heller's sleeve, streaking red lines down to his elbow. The old man's breathing came hard now, not from exhaustion but from rage barely held in check. "You bring that blade near my family again," he warned, "and I swear—" But Grant's foot jerked up again, grazing Heller's leg in one final burst of resistance. It wasn't enough. The colonel's hand darted down, retrieving the knife in one smooth motion. With a grim expression, he pressed the blade, not into flesh, but into Grant's own hand, forcing him to feel the metal he'd used moments ago. "You wanted this," Heller said, twisting just enough for the steel to nick the man's shoulder, slicing through cloth and drawing blood. Grant's gasp was sharp, shocked more by the reversal than the pain itself. "This," Heller continued, voice low and steady as he locked eyes with the man, "is what your choices have earned you." The knife plunged, not deep, not fatal, but angled with exacting precision into the muscle near Grant's shoulder. The man howled, slumping back as pain and adrenaline collided inside him. The fight drained from his body instantly, like air from a punctured lung. Silence returned, stunned, ringing silence. Even the passengers who had cried out earlier now stood mute, frozen by the raw efficiency of what they had witnessed. Nathan continued to press the cloth against Ethan's head, his hand steady despite the shaking around him. Grant Thorne's body twitched once, then sagged fully into the seat. His chest rose and fell in shallow waves, but his eyes flickered with the dawning realization that he had lost. Not just the fight, but something deeper. Heller stepped back slowly, his own hands bloodied, his posture rigid. His gaze remained on Grant as if trying to extract every hidden answer from the man's silence. "You turned your own knife against yourself," Heller whispered, his voice low but steady. The moment the knife lodged into Grant Thorne's own shoulder, the cabin went eerily quiet, as if the act itself had drained the oxygen from the air. The engines still hummed faintly beneath the fuselage, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. The murmurs, the panic, the shouting, all collapsed into a stunned hush. Every passenger held their breath as if afraid that any noise might make it all start again. Colonel Adrian Heller crouched beside Ethan, eyes locked on the slow rise and fall of his nephew's chest. There was blood, too much of it, seeping through his fingers where he pressed against the wound. The pressure of his own heartbeat pounded in his ears, but his hands stayed firm. Years of battlefield triage took over where emotion threatened to sabotage him. He didn't panic. He couldn't afford to. "Stay with me, soldier," he whispered, voice low, barely audible above the low whir of cabin circulation. His hand gently cradled the back of Ethan's head, placing his folded jacket beneath it like a field pillow. "That's an order." Ethan's eyes flickered, his lips parting in a shallow breath, but he said nothing. A pulse throbbed beneath his neck, faint but present. Heller nodded to himself, holding on to that small confirmation. Around him, the stunned silence began to splinter. A boy in row 7 began crying softly, clutching his father's arm. A man 2 rows back reached shakily for the call button. One of the attendants, Dale, a young man with trembling hands and tearful eyes, stood frozen at the front galley, unsure whether to move or to wait for permission that wouldn't come. The other crew members were in various stages of shock, some clutching the back of seats, others gripping phones or oxygen masks that hadn't been needed. Then the pilot's voice broke through the cabin speaker, steadier this time but laced with tension. "Emergency medical response will meet us upon landing. Remain seated. Do not crowd the aisles. I repeat, remain seated." Heller didn't look up. His focus was absolute. He pressed harder against Ethan's wound, noting the skin temperature, watching for signs of slipping consciousness. Time was elastic. Every second stretched. Across from him, Grant Thorne lay slumped against the wall, the knife buried in his own shoulder from the force of his panic. His breath came in ragged gasps. Blood spread in a growing pattern beneath him, soaking into the carpeted floor. His eyes were open but unfocused, his mouth working silently for several seconds before a garbled phrase broke through. "Faces. Replacements. They said he shouldn't exist," he mumbled. Heller turned slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Who told you that?" he asked, voice like gravel on steel. But Grant didn't respond. His gaze drifted away as if seeing something not there. Seconds later, the cockpit door opened and 2 uniformed security officers pushed through, guided by a breathless flight attendant. They scanned the carnage quickly, then moved to cuff Grant. One of them, a middle-aged officer named Roland, paused just long enough to meet Heller's eyes and nod respectfully before lifting the attacker by the arms. Grant groaned, delirious, muttering nonsense. "No eyes. Not with that face. He's not supposed to be here." The colonel said nothing, but the words lodged themselves like splinters under his skin. He looked back at Ethan, brushing a blood-matted strand of hair from his forehead. "He's not a ghost," Heller whispered to himself. "He's my nephew." and I will not lose him." As medics finally boarded the aircraft with stretchers and equipment, the aisle filled with the rapid shuffle of boots and cases. One of them, a medic named Rowan, knelt beside Heller. "Sir, we'll take over now," Rowan said, his voice low and respectful, clearly recognizing the man before him. "Stabilize him first," Heller ordered, not moving. "You move him before he's ready, he crashes." "Start fluids." Pressure rapped to the temple. "Yes, Colonel," Rowan replied without hesitation, immediately relaying the orders to the second medic. The cabin became a blur of organized motion. Passengers remained seated, their eyes fixed on the unfolding triage. No one dared interrupt. Some wept quietly. Others simply stared. When the stretcher was finally rolled in and Ethan lifted onto it, IV in place, bleeding slowed. Heller rose, his knees stiff from kneeling. His palms were sticky with blood, drying into lines across his fingers and wrists. He stared at them for a long moment. They looked like old scars, familiar, worn. He followed Ethan down the aisle, hand resting protectively on the stretcher frame. As they reached the aircraft door, the open hatch revealed a blur of flashing red and blue lights on the tarmac. Outside, the world was moving again. Grant Thorne was carried out behind them, his hands cuffed, his head lolling to one side, eyes empty. He kept muttering as he was wheeled down the ramp. One of the medics asked what he was saying. "Something about the past," Heller muttered, "but the past should have stayed buried." As the colonel stepped onto the tarmac, he looked up at the vast gray sky. A plane had just landed in the distance, unaware of what had happened aboard this one. Life, for the rest of the world, continued undisturbed, but not for him, and not for Ethan. He tightened his jaw, turning his eyes toward the ambulance where his nephew now lay surrounded by machines and strangers. The metal doors began to close. The hardest wars, he thought, are the ones that find you when you're unarmed. Some battles are never left behind, they just change uniforms. The ambulance doors slammed shut behind them, sealing off the sirens and the flashing red chaos of the tarmac. Inside, the cabin lights flickered once before settling into a dim orange glow, casting long shadows over the gurney where Ethan lay. Colonel Adrian Heller sat rigid beside him, one hand wrapped around his nephew's wrist, two fingers pressed to the side of his neck, feeling for every faint beat. The medic across from him worked with a practiced urgency, checking the wound, applying pressure, securing IV lines, but to Heller, everything moved like molasses. Seconds stretched. The colonel had seen time slow down like this before, on battlefields, in smoke-choked bunkers, but never with blood that carried his own name. Ethan stirred. "The man," he murmured, voice barely audible through cracked lips. "He knew me. He said my name." Heller leaned closer. "What did he say, Ethan?" But the boy was already slipping again, eyelids fluttering. A monitor beeped louder in response, drawing the medic's attention. Heller sat back, his mind no longer in the ambulance but retracing the timeline, frame by frame. Grant Thorne. A name that hadn't meant anything an hour ago. A face that might have passed unnoticed. But now the image of that twisted smirk, the precise motion of the knife, the eerie familiarity in how he had moved, would not leave the colonel's mind. Grant had targeted Ethan, not randomly, not blindly, and now the boy said he knew his name. The ambulance made a hard turn. Heller's hand instinctively moved to steady Ethan's arm. He looked down and saw the blood soaking through the gauze, thick and dark, staining the boy's collar like war paint. Heller had seen wounds like this before. He'd treated them in the worst places on Earth, but it wasn't just the injury that haunted him. It was the question, how had this man known his nephew? At the hospital, the entrance bay burst open to a waiting team of trauma nurses and security staff. Heller stepped aside only after confirming the ER doctor was already pressing on Ethan's chest, calling out vitals. The moment the gurney wheeled out of sight, he turned, Not to rest, but to think, and to investigate. Inside the makeshift debriefing room, the air smelled of coffee, antiseptic, and stress. A young federal investigator named Travis Marin was already waiting for him, flipping through the preliminary reports. A few shaken passengers sat nearby, wrapped in blankets, sipping water. None of them looked like they wanted to speak. "We've cordoned off the plane," Travis said, motioning to the images on a nearby tablet. "No one in or out. Witnesses confirm your account. Grant Thorne attacked your nephew with a concealed blade. You neutralized the threat. We're getting statements now." Heller nodded once, then gestured toward the item sealed in a transparent evidence pouch. "The knife." "Let me see it." Travis hesitated. "It's classified as evidence." Now." The authority in the colonel's voice was not something he often used these days, but when it surfaced, it left no room for delay. Travis relented and passed the pouch over the table. Heller picked it up carefully, turning the weapon under the harsh fluorescent lights. It wasn't just a knife. It was a modified combat blade, curved handle, reinforced spine, high-carbon alloy finish. The edges had been resharpened obsessively, not for decoration, but use. Heller's gaze locked on the grip, and his breath slowed. There, etched just above the guard, were 6 numbers, 94-07-63. The serial number was familiar, not in a vague sense, but in the precise, haunting way that sent cold up the spine, because that number belonged to a batch of weapons distributed during a classified operation nearly 2 decades ago. Heller had overseen part of that inventory. He remembered logging those blades into a locked armory file, one marked not for deployment, but for experimental psychological use under internal black tag units. And now one of them had resurfaced in the hands of a man who attacked his nephew. He didn't say a word, didn't flinch, didn't reveal that his pulse had just doubled. Instead, he leaned back, letting the weight of the evidence settle like lead across his shoulders. Travis was still speaking, something about transporting the suspect, Grant Thorne, to a federal holding center. But Heller had already begun disconnecting himself from the noise. His mind was working now, sharper than it had in years. This wasn't random. This wasn't personal revenge or passenger rage or psychotic delusion. This was a message. One sent not with words, but with blood, and a weapon from a file that no civilian should ever have touched. He glanced back at the hallway where Ethan had been taken, hearing only the echo of his nephew's broken sentence. "He said my name." The implications tore into him. Someone wanted Ethan harmed or taken. Someone with knowledge of the past and access to things that should have been buried forever. The fluorescent light above flickered once, then steadied. Heller rose from the table, leaving the evidence pouch behind. His face was calm, but inside, his mind burned. The war he thought he'd buried had returned, not with enemies in uniforms, but with ghosts wearing civilian clothes and speaking names they were never supposed to know. As he stepped out into the corridor, the hallway seemed longer than it had minutes ago. Nurses moved in slow patterns. A janitor pushed a squeaking cart. A security guard scratched his neck and muttered into a radio. Everything felt just a little off, like the world was shifting again, subtly but unstoppably. Colonel Adrian Heller moved toward the room where Ethan was being treated, his footsteps steady, but his thoughts spiraling into places he'd locked away. If the past was reaching for him again, he thought, it had chosen the cruelest way to make contact. The hospital room was dim, wrapped in the sterile silence that always seemed to fall after visiting hours. Machines hummed in a quiet rhythm, their screens casting pale green and amber glows across the walls. Ethan lay motionless, his breathing shallow but steady, a faint line of bruising trailing across his temple where the blade had come too close to ending everything. Colonel Adrian Heller stood at the tall window, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the city lights far below. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass, older, wearier, yet sharp as ever. the kind of face that had watched wars end and secrets rot behind medals. Behind him, the door opened with a subtle click. No knock, just the careful, deliberate entry of a man who knew how to move without stirring noise. Captain Warren Dace stepped in, his federal liaison badge tucked behind a brown leather coat, his steps slow but confident. Heller didn't turn. "They're calling it a civilian hero story," Warren said, his voice low and gravel-thick, like it hadn't been used much since the last debriefing room. Still, Heller said nothing. Warren exhaled through his nose, stepping closer, eyeing the machines, the boy, the weary soldier by the glass. "Media's swarming. Pilot says you saved everyone. Knife to the head, disarmed the guy with your bare hands. Classic Heller move." Heller finally spoke, but it wasn't about the headlines. Grant Thorne. Warren stiffened slightly, recognizing the name. The attacker. "They're running a psychiatric profile now. He's unstable, obviously. He was dishonorably discharged 15 years ago," Heller said flatly. He turned slowly, the light catching the fatigue under his eyes. "Psychological instability. That's what the report said. But that's not what caught me." Warren tilted his head. "Then what did?" Heller stepped closer to Ethan's bed, looking down at the pale, unconscious face. "He served under Project Spectre." For a moment, the hum of machines seemed to grow louder, like the room was waiting for something to break. Warren's face lost its color. He took a step back, disbelief flickering behind his eyes. "Spectre," he whispered. "That program was shut down. Years ago. Buried under enough red tape to disappear forever. That's what we were told." Heller's tone was calm, but a storm brewed beneath. "But Thorne said Ethan wasn't supposed to exist." He said, he knew his name. Warren ran a hand across his mouth, mind racing. Project Spectre was a ghost project. Psychological warfare, identity substitution, memory mapping, experimental to the point of illegal. They said it got out of control. They swore it was shut down. "I signed clearance documents on that project," Heller said, stepping away from the bed, voice rising just slightly. "I saw what they were doing, building soldiers who could become other people, embedding memory fragments, cloning behavioral patterns. But this," he motioned to Ethan, "this wasn't part of it." Warren frowned. "Then what do you think this is?" Heller's jaw tightened. "A return." He began pacing, something he rarely did. Thorne wasn't trying to kill Ethan. He was trying to say something. His words, not supposed to exist, weren't just crazy talk. And the blade? Warren, it wasn't standard issue. It was Spectre gear, modified combat steel. I recognized the design. The serial number on the hilt, it was from the Armory 9 storage list. "That's impossible," Warren muttered, visibly shaken. "All Spectre gear was destroyed." "Unless someone kept a few pieces," Heller shot back. "Someone who didn't want Spectre buried." Silence fell between them. The monitor beeped. The rain outside traced patterns on the glass like a code being written by nature itself. Finally, Warren spoke again, his voice low. "Are you saying Ethan's part of it?" "I'm saying I don't know," Heller replied, but his eyes betrayed the doubt. He was never supposed to be connected. But now, I can't ignore the signs. Warren rubbed his eyes, his tone pleading with reason. "You think this is Spectre's way of resurfacing? Using Ethan to draw you out? Or worse, test something?" "I don't know yet," Heller answered quietly. "But if this was just a madman with a knife, why does it feel like the war never ended?" Neither man spoke for a long time. The machines pulsed. Ethan shifted faintly in his sleep, unaware of the storm gathering around his name. Warren finally asked, "So, what now?" Heller's voice was like steel left in snow. "Now we find out what they left behind, and who had the nerve to dig it back up." He moved to the door, pausing as he looked back at the pale figure in the hospital bed. "Because if this was an old war returning, Heller said quietly. Then someone reopened the file. He drove a knife into the colonel's nephew's head, blood spilling down the seat as screams filled the cabin. If you believe cruelty must always meet its reckoning, hit subscribe now, because justice never misses its mark. Under the cold hum of fluorescent lights, the door to Detention Room 7 slid open with a hiss of hydraulics. Colonel Adrian Heller stepped inside without pause, his boots tapping softly against the linoleum floor. 2 armed guards flanked the room's interior corners, eyes tracking his every movement. In the center, restrained to the medical cot by thick nylon cuffs, lay Grant Thorne, his skin pale, his breathing shallow, and his right hand twitching with frantic purpose across a blood-stained hospital sheet. He was scribbling something. Symbols, numbers, disconnected fragments of names, places, and codes, none of it immediately coherent, but all of it deliberate. Heller didn't speak. He simply watched, arms folded behind his back, face unreadable. The silence pressed down like weight in the room, heavy and waiting. Then, without warning, Grant's eyes flew open, wide, bloodshot, too lucid for a man on sedation. His pupils snapped to Heller like magnets to steel. "You didn't kill me," he said, voice thin but laced with mockery, "because you still don't know who sent me." Heller's posture didn't change, but something in his jaw tensed. He moved forward, stopping just beside the bed. "I didn't kill you," he said coldly, "because I needed to know why you came." Grant tilted his head slightly, the trace of a grin curling one side of his mouth. "Curiosity. That's your weakness. That's why they picked you to raise him." Heller's gaze darkened, his expression stony. "Raise who?" "Your nephew," Grant whispered, the words rolling off his tongue like bait on a hook. "He's not who you think he is." The temperature in the room seemed to shift, subtle, but enough to make the guards straighten slightly. Heller took a half-step closer, now looming directly over the restrained man. "You're wasting what little time you have left." Grant's laughter cracked the silence like brittle glass. "You think this is about me? I was just the delivery system. The message was the blade." His smile faded then, replaced by something more sober. "After the crash, they didn't expect you to get so attached." A beat passed. Just one. But it was long enough for the room to stretch with tension. Heller's voice dropped. "What crash?" Grant's eyes gleamed. "The training incident. The fire. Your brother died, remember? You pulled that boy out yourself. But what you don't remember is that you didn't pull out your nephew. You pulled out what they left in his place." For a moment, the words didn't register. They floated in the space between them, absurd and monstrous. Then Heller's face shifted, just slightly, just enough. He stepped back, his spine stiffening. "You're lying," he said, but there was no weight behind it. Grant chuckled low in his throat. "Then why do his blood records show Spectre protocol markers?" The colonel's breathing grew shallow. His mind spiraled back to the hospital, to the blood work run as part of standard trauma treatment. The charts, the anomalous markers flagged by one of the medics, the ones Heller had dismissed as misprints. At the time, they had meant nothing, but now they pulsed with new meaning. Grant leaned forward as far as his restraints would allow. "They gave you a replacement. Because you were loyal. Because they needed to know if the experiment could survive in the hands of a man who still believed in duty." His voice trembled with a mix of bitterness and awe. "You were part of the program and never knew it." One of the guards stepped forward. "Sir, should we?" Heller raised a hand, silencing him. His mind raced. It couldn't be true. Ethan, his Ethan, was flesh and blood. He remembered the boy's first words, the way he clung to him after the funeral, the birthdays, the way he asked about the stars during their night walks. All of it real. All of it undeniable. And yet, how could Grant know the serial code on that knife? How did he know Ethan's name before the flight? And why had the words "after the crash" cut deeper than the blade itself. He stared at the man bound to the cot. "If any of this is true," Heller said, voice like frost, "then why tell me?" Grant's grin returned, hollow this time. "Because they'll erase me soon. They always do with failed assets. But if I plant the doubt, that seed, you'll dig deeper. You're a soldier. You never let go of a lead." The colonel's eyes narrowed. Something inside him shifted. Not belief, not yet, but suspicion. A fracture in the certainty he'd built his life around. He turned to leave. Grant called after him, voice rising as the drugs dulled his clarity again. "You can't protect him from what he is. You don't raise a ghost and expect it not to haunt you." Heller paused at the door but didn't turn around. His face, reflected briefly in the metal surface, was pale and distant. He said nothing more. Behind him, Grant laughed until it collapsed into a cough. The sound echoed strangely, like metal against water. The guards shut the door. In the hallway outside, Heller walked slowly, his boots no longer echoing with certainty. The past he had buried was not only alive, it was pointing fingers. And those fingers led to the boy who had once called him Uncle, without hesitation. He didn't know where the next step would take him, but he knew the ground beneath him had changed. Truth, he thought, can wound deeper than any knife. That night, unable to rest, Heller slipped through the side entrance of the Federal Archives building, his breath sharp against the cold air as the metal door clicked shut behind him. No alarm sounded. His credentials, though aged, still worked. The security cameras above the corridor blinked red but did not track him. He moved like a ghost, every step silent on the polished linoleum floor, his military instincts guiding him through the maze of steel cabinets and flickering overhead lights. Inside the restricted records wing, he passed rows of sealed drawers marked with old operation codes, some forgotten, others buried beneath layers of bureaucratic dust. He scanned his ID at the final checkpoint. A quiet beep. The vault's interior lights flickered on, dim and sterile. Heller didn't waste time. He moved straight to the files under Class D, Obsolete Covert Programs, and began typing. Project Spectre. The terminal resisted for a moment, red text blinking, restricted, decommissioned archive. But a second code, one Heller remembered from a long-abandoned clearance level, unlocked the database. Rows of digital folders flooded the screen. Many were corrupted, incomplete, or marked for destruction. But one name pulled him in like gravity. Spectre B3. Raynor, Ethan. He clicked. What he saw unraveled everything he thought he knew. A digital folder opened, and within it, a series of scanned documents and old video logs populated the screen. The header read, Reconstruction Program, Guardian-based conditioning trials. Beneath it, a series of terms chilled him. Biometric patchwork, psychological mimicry, survival simulation scenarios. His eyes locked on a file titled, Subject Allocation, Raynor, Ethan, Guardian, Heller, Adrian. He clicked again. A photograph loaded, Ethan, at age 6, sitting beside a hospital cot, eyes vacant, hooked to an array of biometric monitors. A chart beside the image showed genetic overlays, blood type anomalies, even emotional response simulations. Parental loss trigger response measured, 81% stability achieved. Heller's stomach turned. He scrolled down. Another document confirmed the unthinkable. Ethan hadn't simply survived the crash all those years ago. He had been rebuilt. The boy's body had suffered massive trauma during the vehicle explosion that killed his father, Heller's brother. The recovery had seemed miraculous at the time, but now the truth surfaced like a corpse dragged from deep waters. A covert military program, Spectre, had used Ethan as a test subject in a psychological endurance project, reconstructing him as part of a grieving soldier's recovery protocol. And Heller, unknowingly, had been part of the test. He sank into the nearby chair, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the terminal keys. The glow of the screen painted harsh shadows across his face. A wave of betrayal hit him harder than any battlefield ambush. He had lived, bled, and fought to protect Ethan. Every decision, every sacrifice, every moment of fatherly instinct had been real, yet it was all under observation, engineered to measure attachment, resilience, and control. The truth was cruel. He hadn't saved his nephew from the world. The world had given him Ethan as a simulation, a ghost of someone he thought was real. He looked back at the file, now showing surveillance footage, older clips from years ago, of Heller and Ethan at parks, airports, even hospital rooms. Each file was labeled with analysis: guardian response, protective; subject reaction, normalized familial behavior; bond depth, stable. There had never been privacy. There had never been freedom. A soft creak echoed from the corridor. Heller froze. Footsteps passed beyond the steel-reinforced door. Someone else was working late, or worse, someone had noticed the terminal's activation. He leaned in quickly and copied the folder to a portable drive, ejecting it just before the hallway footsteps faded. Then he stood, staring one last time at the folder name. Spectre B3. Raynor, Ethan. A name, a lie, a code. He slid the drive into his inner coat pocket and walked back into the corridor, his mind reeling. Every conversation he'd had with Ethan, every moment of affection or discipline, was now tainted with the question: was it real, or was it measured? By the time he stepped outside, the wind had picked up, sweeping dead leaves across the asphalt of the dark parking lot. Thunder grumbled above, as if nature itself disapproved of the truths unburied. He climbed into his vehicle and sat still for a long while. Headlights off, engine quiet. The memory of Ethan calling him Uncle echoed through his thoughts, warm, trusting, innocent. But now even that word felt fragile. He gripped the steering wheel, jaw clenched, eyes refusing to water. This wasn't a coincidence. Grant Thorne's attack hadn't been random rage. It had been a trigger, a final stage in an experiment designed to test Heller's response to harm. Only this time, they had gone too far. He pulled away from the curb, tires crunching against gravel. Spectre, he muttered aloud, voice low and dangerous. Wasn't just a project. He glanced once more at the drive, glowing faintly in the passenger seat. It was unfinished business. The footsteps were soft but deliberate, crunching the gravel just beyond the porch of the old tactical cabin. Colonel Adrian Heller's hand froze on the classified file, his eyes narrowing as the sound drew closer. He flicked the curtains closed and turned back toward Ethan, who sat rigid at the small wooden table, the manila folder trembling in his hands. "What was that?" Ethan asked, his voice a strained whisper. His eyes, still swollen and bruised from the plane attack, looked even more fragile under the cabin's low amber light. "Keep quiet," Heller ordered, not unkindly, but with the firm edge of someone who had heard footsteps like that before, in jungles, deserts, and ruined cities where enemies didn't announce themselves. He checked the slide of his sidearm, then moved quickly to the wall panel beside the fireplace. A latch clicked open, revealing a recessed compartment holding a compact rifle and a thermal scope. He didn't hesitate. "They moved fast," he muttered under his breath. "Too fast." Ethan rose unsteadily, still clutching the folder. "Uncle, what's happening? Who would follow us here?" Heller didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned through the scope toward the tree line, sweeping in arcs, then narrowing in on movement near the bend of the road. Two shapes, male, moving with intention. Not journalists, not police. He turned back and grabbed Ethan's shoulders, steadying him. "Listen to me. Do you remember the accident? The one that took your father?" Ethan blinked, startled by the sudden shift in tone. "I remember fire. A loud blast, screaming. But it's all scattered, like pieces of someone else's life." "That's because it wasn't just an accident," Heller said quietly. He pulled a chair out beside Ethan and opened the rest of the file. The young man's face paled as page after page revealed medical scans, reconstruction data, and military clearance levels far above anything civilians should ever see. "These," Heller said, tapping the DNA recovery records, "were from your father's remains." Ethan's voice caught in his throat. "So, I was made from him?" "Rebuilt?" Heller nodded once. "They called it Spectre Protocol. Recovery through replication. You were never supposed to know." Ethan sat back hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Then what am I?" he whispered. "Some test?" "You are Ethan Rayner," Heller said firmly. "My nephew. My blood, and more real than any of the cowards who built you." But Ethan couldn't meet his eyes. He looked down at his hands, suddenly unsure of their meaning. "How long have you known?" "I suspected," the colonel replied, "but today confirmed it." The moment froze. Both men sat in silence, the file open like a wound between them. Then came the sound again, closer this time. A deliberate crunch of boots on gravel, no longer cautious but assertive. Heller rose, peering through the narrow slit of the boarded window. One of the men approaching had a flashlight clipped to his vest, the beam sweeping in slow arcs along the ground. The other held something shorter than a rifle, possibly a silenced submachine gun. "We have company," Heller said quietly. "Not police, military tactics, controlled pacing, likely Spectre retrieval." Ethan stood quickly. "Why would they be retrieving me now?" "Because they know you know," Heller replied, "and maybe that changes your value." He moved to the doorway and engaged the deadbolt, then turned off the lights with a sharp flip of the switch. The cabin was plunged into shadows, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace. Ethan's breathing echoed in the quiet. Heller moved toward a hidden panel in the floor and handed Ethan a small sidearm. "You remember how I taught you to aim?" Ethan stared at the weapon like it was a question about himself, but he nodded slowly. A sudden voice called out from beyond the front porch. "Colonel Heller," it said, cold and calm. "We know you're inside. We don't want to hurt anyone. You're in possession of classified material. Let's make this easy." Ethan's eyes widened. "They found us." "No," Heller corrected, voice low and grim. "They never lost us." He placed a finger to his lips, then crept toward the back hallway, guiding Ethan silently behind him. Every step across the cabin floorboard creaked slightly, as if warning them that time was running out. Another voice, different this time, spoke louder. "We know about the file, about Spectre. The boy isn't authorized to remain unsupervised." Ethan froze. "They're talking like I'm some kind of asset," Heller finished. "That's what they see." At the rear window, the colonel scanned the tree line again. A third figure was now flanking toward the side, a maneuver designed to trap them inside. Heller's jaw tightened. "I'll buy us time," he said. Ethan grabbed his arm. "No, we go together." "Not yet," Heller replied. "You need to understand what's happening. These men aren't after vengeance. They're executing protocol. And protocols don't leave room for family footsteps circled toward the porch." The voice returned, closer, more direct. "You have 5 seconds to comply, Colonel." "Then we enter." The colonel turned to Ethan and gripped his shoulder. "Whatever you read in that file," he said, "doesn't define you." "I don't feel real," Ethan whispered, his voice barely holding together. Heller leaned closer, his eyes fierce but unwavering. "You're about to see," he whispered, "that the dead never stay buried when someone needs them alive. Some truths don't end wars. They start new ones." The cabin lights flickered once, then went dark. Colonel Adrian Heller didn't flinch. He dropped into a crouch beside the table, motioning sharply toward Ethan with 2 fingers. "Back room." Now his voice was barely audible, but it cut through the heavy silence like a blade. Ethan, clutching the classified Spectre file against his chest, nodded silently and vanished through the narrow hallway to the rear of the cabin. Outside, beyond the single front window, Heller saw them. Two figures advancing through the dense mist, flashlights sweeping across the pine needle-covered ground. The way they moved, low stances, no wasted motion, told him everything he needed to know. Not law enforcement. These were trained men. Quiet, fast, surgical. His heartbeat remained steady, his breathing slow. Every second counted now. The front porch creaked beneath the weight of boots. Then a pause. A soft knock, not polite, not hesitant, controlled. "Colonel Heller," a calm voice called out from beyond the door. "You shouldn't have taken classified material." The colonel exhaled through his nose, rising slowly from cover. He stepped into view, sidearm drawn but angled low. "Reese Corin," he said, his voice flat. "I should have known." A pause, then the door opened a crack. Rain-slick light cut across the floor. Commander Reese Corin entered, flanked by another silent man whose eyes darted mechanically around the room. Corin looked older than Heller remembered, leaner, tighter around the eyes but no less precise. He wore a nondescript gray jacket, the kind that hid weapons and secrets equally well. "You created a lie," Heller said evenly, stepping further into the open, "and you left it breathing." Reese offered a faint smile, the kind one gives to a student who finally catches up. "No, Colonel. We created a legacy. Your nephew is the last of Spectre's prototypes." Behind Heller, somewhere down the hallway, a floorboard creaked. Ethan was still there, listening. Reese took one measured step inside. "The attack on the plane, Thorne, wasn't meant to kill. It was retrieval. But you interfered. You expect me to hand him over?" Heller asked, weapon rising slightly. Reese shrugged. "You can't hide him forever. You know that. He doesn't belong in the world you think he does." The colonel took a slow breath. "He belongs where I say he does. He's my responsibility. He's government property. He's family." Lightning cracked in the distance. A flash of light spilled across Reese's face, momentarily revealing the cold confidence in his eyes. "You were always good at loyalty, Adrian," he said softly, "even when it blinded you." "I taught you to fight," Heller said, eyes locked on him. "I didn't teach you to betray." "I didn't betray." I adapted. Heller's eyes flicked to the second man, still near the threshold, watching silently. Backup. Likely more in the tree line. This was no negotiation. This was positioning. They'd try to flank, corner, and extract. Clean, quiet. That's how Spectre operated. That's how Heller had taught them. "You came here thinking I'd hand him over?" the colonel asked. "I came here because we underestimated your attachment," Reese replied, "and because retrieval units tend to leave a mess. I was sent to offer you a cleaner path, and what happens if I say no?" Reese smiled again, faint and razor-thin. "Then I guess you'll force me to do this the way we used to." Heller's finger tightened around the trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. The air was charged, electrified with unspoken threats. Every instinct screamed that a line had been crossed and there would be no stepping back from it. The colonel's voice lowered, deathly calm. "Then I guess you'll have to retrieve him through me." A pause. Reese's eyes flicked toward the hallway. Outside, thunder rolled like distant artillery. "Old wars," Reese said. "Never die. They just go off the record." Gunfire erupted like thunder inside the cabin. Wood splintered. Drywall burst in clouds. Heller's shoulder jerked back as he fired into the doorway, striking the first intruder in the thigh. The man collapsed with a pained grunt, his rifle skidding across the floor. The kitchen walls shook as another volley shredded the frame near the window. Glass exploded inward in a storm of shards. "Down!" Heller barked, already moving. Ethan hit the floor behind the counter, clutching the classified file like it held his life, because it did. Dust filled the air, mixing with the acrid sting of gunpowder and the cold metallic scent of adrenaline. Heller pressed his back against the fridge, blood from a shallow graze painting his sleeve. But his grip on the pistol never wavered. Outside, boots pounded gravel in perfect rhythm. Trained, efficient, no hesitation. These weren't agents, they were hunters. Predators sent by men who knew how to erase trails with silence and fire. A shadow passed the window. Heller's eyes narrowed. He waited, timing the breath between footfalls. When the door swung open again, he fired twice. A body slumped into the threshold, blocking the entrance. Another tried to leap over it. Heller met him with a knee and a shot to the chest. "Ethan!" he shouted between bursts. "Rear exit!" Now. But Ethan froze. Through the swirling haze, he'd caught sight of someone stepping in slow, deliberate confidence. Reese Corin. He wore a reinforced vest, matte black, military cut. His left arm hung slightly lower, still stiff from the shot Heller gave him on the plane. But his smirk was intact. "He doesn't even know what he is," Reese called out, voice steady under the chaos. His rifle was raised but not yet firing. "Does he know, Colonel? Does he know what you buried?" Heller turned sharply, shielding Ethan with his body. "Drop the weapon, Reese. This doesn't end with you walking out." "No," Reese replied, a dark glint in his eyes. "But it might end with your legacy walking back in." His finger moved. Heller fired first. The shot tore through Reese's shoulder, spinning him sideways with a grunt. He stumbled into the wall, but to Heller's horror he laughed, loud, ragged, amused. "You still shoot like a commander," Reese coughed, smearing blood across his vest. "But Spectre doesn't die with me." Suddenly, a metallic clink bounced across the floor. "Grenade!" Heller yelled. He hurled himself over Ethan, dragging them both behind the heavy oak table as the flashbang detonated. White heat swallowed the room. The air cracked with blinding brilliance. Time shattered. For a long moment, silence followed. Then sound returned like a wave, muffled groans, a sharp ringing in the ears, the crackling of something burning. Heller's eyes burned as he sat up, blinking hard. The cabin was torn open like a shell. Reese and his men were gone. The wind had shifted. The threat had retreated. Ethan knelt beside his uncle, pressing down on a cut across Heller's ribs, hands trembling. "Uncle Adrian, they'll come again." Heller nodded grimly, using the counter to steady himself as he rose. His breath came in ragged pulls, but his resolve had hardened. He looked toward the splintered doorway, jaw clenched. "Let them," he said quietly, voice like steel drawn from memory. "This time, they'll find a soldier who remembers how to fight ghosts." The package arrived just after dusk. It was waiting on the rusted porch swing outside Ethan Rayner's rented cottage. No courier, no footprints, no sound of approach. Just a plain box, weather-stained, sealed with a single strip of green tape. The air still smelled of salt from the nearby sea, but something about the way the box sat, perfectly centered, motionless despite the breeze, made Ethan's chest tighten. He hesitated before picking it up, eyes scanning the empty gravel road beyond the gate. No car, no footsteps, only the distant churn of the waves. With cautious fingers, he peeled the tape and lifted the lid. Inside, a single dog tag, scuffed and dulled with time. Its lettering was clear despite the wear, A. Heller. Beneath it lay a folded slip of paper, the edges yellowed slightly, as if it had traveled far. Ethan's breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, square, efficient. His uncle's. He hadn't seen that penmanship since the day they disappeared into the trees behind the cabin. He unfolded the note with shaking hands. "Spectre is watching." So am I. For a moment, he didn't move. The message wasn't just a reassurance, it was a declaration, a promise. His fingers clenched around the tag as if he feared it might vanish like a dream. He sank onto the steps, heart pounding, mind racing. It had been 3 weeks since the cabin, 3 weeks since the gunfire, the flashbang, the vanishing trail of Commander Reese Corin and his men. Since then, Ethan had disappeared into a quiet town off the northern coast, registered under a new name, Ellis Dane. He worked at a marine repair shop during the day, patching boats and rewiring outboard engines. At night, he coded encryption algorithms on a decade-old laptop, pretending the flicker of the screen was just ordinary life. But it wasn't. He knew better now. He hadn't asked questions when the military transport took him away from the scene. He hadn't asked when the men in plain clothes debriefed him with calm urgency and sealed files. He hadn't even asked when the check-in visits stopped. Because Ethan knew what silence meant in this world, it was the sound of truths being buried, or buried alive. Still, a part of him kept searching. Every program he wrote was threaded with hidden trackers, every line of code a quiet rebellion. He no longer believed in the name he wore or the life he led. And now, with this box, this message, everything shifted again. He looked out toward the shoreline where the horizon blurred into fog. The same waves crashed there every evening, mindless and eternal. Yet now they seemed to echo with something else, an unfinished war humming beneath the tide. Behind him, the porch light buzzed and flickered. Across the cottage, a wall was covered with clippings, photos of military officers, blurred security footage from airports, fragments of flight manifests. Ethan had begun mapping the connections in secret, trying to understand what Spectre had been, and what it still was. Now he knew his uncle was alive, watching, waiting. He brought the dog tag to his lips, eyes closed, trying to remember the steady presence of Colonel Heller, the way he commanded space without raising his voice, the way his hand never trembled, not even under fire, the way he looked at Ethan, not as a mission, but as blood. And yet, was he? Ethan stood slowly, the tag cold against his skin, and walked back inside. He locked the door behind him and slid the bolt. Then he opened his encrypted terminal and began typing again. Not a map this time, but a message. To no one and everyone. If you can read this, Spectre isn't buried. It's breathing. The printer beside him hummed to life, spitting out fresh pages. Names, coordinates, dossiers redacted in blocks of ink. Ethan moved like a man no longer afraid of truth. His body still bore scars from the attack, but his mind burned sharper than ever. He wasn't just a subject anymore. He was a witness. Somewhere out there, Heller was still fighting. Maybe underground, maybe alone, but not forgotten. Ethan would make sure of that. He glanced at the package again. There had been no return address, but the smell of engine oil still lingered faintly on the paper, like it had been carried by someone who once lived in armories and outposts, someone who knew war better than sleep. A final line in the letter caught his eye, one he had missed in the flood of emotion. A soldier's duty isn't to forget what he fought for, but to guard it quietly, long after the war ends. Ethan stepped to the window, gazing out over the water as the first stars appeared in the sky. His reflection in the glass was no longer that of a boy looking for his place. It was of a man carrying legacy like a hidden blade. And sometimes, the sharpest blade isn't in a soldier's hand, it's in the truth he refuses to let die. He raised a blade in arrogance and watched it return through his own hand seconds later. If you believe every act of violence circles back to its source, subscribe now, because justice always finishes the fight. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores anger, protection, and the weight of authority when justice is personal. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on restraint, courage, and standing up against wrongdoing without resorting to violence.